the Honorable Xavier Main, Minister of State, Ministry of Labor and Social Security, the Honorable Pernell Charles Sr., stalwart of the Jamaican Labor Movement, former Minister of Government and retired Member of Parliament, Ms. Claudine Allen, General Manager, JN Foundation, our panelists, the Honorable Donna Parchment Brown, the Political Ombudsman, Mr. Danny Roberts, Head, Hugh Shearer, Labor Studies Institute at the Consortium for Social Development and Research at the University of the West Indies Open Campus, Mr. Roddy Thomas, Vice President, Bustamante Industrial Trade Union, Mr. O'Neill Grant, Trade Unionist and President of the Jamaica Civil Association, members of staff of the JN Foundation, members of staff of the Jamaica National Group, ladies and gentlemen, Jamaicans at home and abroad, good afternoon, a hearty welcome. I am Sonia Stanley Nair from the Institute of Caribbean Studies at the University of the West Indies and Senior Lecturer in Cultural Studies. I will be your moderator for this event, and it is my pleasure to be here with you. This event is being held on Labor Day under the theme From Raising Cain to Remote Work, and explores the evolution of work and labor laws in Jamaica. It is, however, significant for us to put the recognition of Labor Day in context. The International Labor Day movement came out of the struggle to free workers from extreme conditions of repression, exploitation, and racism, which generally existed in the late 19th century. Since May 1980, that day has been observed by many countries as the day on which labor movements are officially commemorated. However, some countries chose different days in May to celebrate it. In Jamaica, Labor Day is celebrated on May 23rd of each year, and in this year, it is being celebrated on Monday, May 24th, because the 23rd fell on a Sunday. And I know some of us are very happy for the long weekend. The labor movement in Jamaica emerged from the sweat and tears of the working class. That period of most significance in Jamaica's history, which influenced the privileges we enjoy today, was in the 1930s. The country was rife with labor unrest. Laborers were grossly underpaid, and several strikes broke out across the island with all the workers asking for the same thing: better wages. Many of you may be too young to remember, so this event is to bring you in mind of significant moments in Jamaica's history. The most outstanding of these unrests was a riot at Frome Sugar Factory in Westmoreland, which occurred in May 1938. One prominent figure who arose from the 1938 upheavals was St. William Grant. He was a labor leader, Black nationalist, and Garveyite. Grant spoke vociferously for the rights of workers and was even arrested in 1938 for the firm stand he took on the subject. Today, we will not only speak of St. William Grant and other noted martyrs of the labor movement, but also the challenges we now face and how we can resolve these challenges. Before we do so, I will now invite Ms. Claudine Allen, General Manager of the JN Foundation, to bring greetings and inform us why the JN Foundation is hosting this event. Ms. Claudine Allen.
Our moderator, Dr. Sonia Stanley Nair, Director and Senior Lecturer at the Institute of Caribbean Studies at the UWI Mona, the Honorable Xavier Main, Minister of State in the Ministry of Labor and Social Security, our panelists, the Honorable Pernell Charles Sr., stalwart of the labor movement in Jamaica, former Minister of Government and retired Member of Parliament, the Honorable Donna Parchment Brown, the Political Ombudsman, Mr. Danny Roberts, Head Hugh Shearer Labor Studies Institute at the UWI Open Campus, Mr. O'Neill Grant, President of the Jamaica Civil Service Association, and Mr. Roddy Thomas, Vice President of the BITU, Jane Foundation members of staff, members of the Jamaica National Group, senior leaders of the Jamaica National Group, Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It is my pleasure to welcome you to what promises to be a thought-provoking discussion on our history and our future. From raising Cain to remote work, examines the evolution of work and labor laws in Jamaica. And we are hosting this discussion today as we recognize Labor Day's rich historical roots and significance to our people. It is a day on which we celebrate community involvement across our country, which evolved out of the struggle to free workers from the extreme conditions of repression, exploitation, classism, and racism of the day. Usually, Labor Day would be observed with a blitz of activities across the country as Jamaicans join together to undertake meaningful and helpful work in their communities. At the Jain Foundation, this calendar event was one of the highlights of our activities each year. Traditionally, we called on our cadre of volunteers to give personal time, thought, and action to initiatives that enrich lives and build communities. However, due to COVID-19 restrictions, many face-to-face activities have been scaled back, including today, which has been designated a no movement day by our government. Now, even as we stay home, stay safe, and clean up our spaces, it is important to remember the genesis of the day and discuss how its focus and impact have changed since its inception. It must also be underscored that the goal of this discussion is to raise awareness about the importance of Labor Day and highlight the sacrifices our fore-parents made so that we can now benefit from the labor laws which are in force today. While there is still work to be done, we cannot disagree that the strong advocacy of trade unionists, community leaders, and political representatives has redounded well to our collective benefits. Today, our labor laws nurture productivity and protect the interests of workers and employers alike. We are at a point where that evolution must continue if we are to make Jamaica the place of choice to live, work, raise families, and to do business. Our esteemed panelists will explore these issues in the discussion to come. The Jain Foundation, and by extension the Jain Group, prides itself on being active in national development and promoting Jamaica's culture. To this end, in 2015, the Foundation embarked on a mission to unveil and illustrate the history of the Jamaican people by documenting it at the parish level. Before that, in 2010, the story of Westmoreland, which influences this discussion today, was recorded by Marguerite Curtin and published with the sponsorship of the Jain Foundation. Today, in collaboration with the History and Archaeology Department at UA, we research and document the history of other Jamaican parishes. Accompanied by captivating photographs of historical sites, this content is housed on the project's website, Parish Histories of Jamaica.org. To date, the project has published the history of 7 parishes, namely Portland, Trelawney, St. Mary, St. Thomas, St. Catherine, St. Elizabeth, and St. James. We're now working on the parish history of Kingston and St. Anne, and we are to start the history of Hanover and St. Andrew very soon. It is our hope that the documentation of our past experiences, the work of our researchers, will prove useful for us all as we continue to define ourselves and nurture our collective pride in who we are and who we strive to be. Once again, thank you for celebrating Labor Day with us, and we invite you to stay for the rest of the session, which promises to be informative and thought-provoking. And when we're through, visit parishhistoriesofjamaica.org and learn about the history of your parish. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Allen, for highlighting the genesis of Labor Day, and our congratulations to the Jain Foundation for its collaborative effort with the UWI to write parish histories which will inform and empower Jamaicans for generations to come about the road we traveled as a developing country. I would like to now invite Minister of State in the Ministry of Labor and Social Security, the Honorable Xavier Main, to also bring us greetings. Minister Main.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure for me to bring greetings on behalf of the Ministry of Labor and Social Security. Today's webinar is of historic importance as it brings into focus the atrocities that our fore-parents had to endure on the job prior to 1938. Back then, our labor force was heavily dependent on agriculture and had to work in less than ideal conditions for nominal wages. Facing serious exploitation from their employers, these workers decided to raise their voices in righteous indignation against the indignity of their servitude. This led to an upheaval which caused widespread strikes, mass protests, looting, and loss of lives. Interestingly, it was these militant industrial actions that proved to be the turning point in Jamaica's labor and trade union movement. As a result, we now have a more diverse labor force where all categories of workers have a right to union representation, and labor laws are now enacted to protect the rights of both workers and employers. Unfortunately, the COVID-19 pandemic has negatively impacted several industries and has compromised some of our labor laws. However, it has accelerated digitization and forced some businesses to operate remotely in order to prevent physical interactions. It is against this background, I believe that today's theme, from raising Cain to remote work, is timely. It gives us a chance to reflect on where we are coming from as a labor force, but more importantly, allows us to focus on where we are going in terms of the future of work. Ladies and gentlemen, if we are to successfully transition to remote work, it is paramount that our workers and employers continue to upskill and reskill themselves so that we can remain competitive on the global market. The government, through the Ministry of Labor and Social Security, is committed to doing our part to build on the legacy of our ancestors. We continue to embrace the decent work agenda, which is to improve the health and safety of our workers, promote equal opportunities for persons with disabilities, reform our labor market, and increase productivity. We believe that if together we can achieve these objectives, then we will be on our way to accomplishing our Vision 2030 of being the place of choice to live, work, raise families, and do business. Let me take the opportunity to acknowledge our tripartite partners, workers, employers, and unions who have been very cooperative in fostering social dialogue and industrial harmony in Jamaica. Have a wonderful Workers' Week and a productive Labor Day when it comes. God bless you all and enjoy the rest of the proceedings.
Thank you very much, Minister Main, for your greetings. It was absolutely informative. Today we have with us a foundation member and stalwart of the labor movement, none other than the Honorable Pernell Charles Sr., a retired member of Parliament, whom we now invite to bring remarks and share his perspective about the origins and evolution of the labor movement, the Honorable Pernell Charles Sr.
First, let me congratulate JN for these programs. I think they do well for the development of trade union and politics in Jamaica and for education of the new generation as to what took us where we are now. In the 1930s, a social revolution took place. And I must say that I was born in that period, which probably attracted me when I got in at a later stage. So the social revolution in the 1930s presented in 1936, the first trade union was established. Alan George Coombs and Hugh Buchanan were the initiators of the union during that time. Coombs was a contractor who organized some 600 workers who pledged to support him in a society to demand better terms and conditions of employment and better wages for them. The first march was broken up by the then police crew. Coombs invited Bustamante to join him in defending the workers. It is said that Bustamante had the money to help do the organization. And therefore, Buster gladly came on board. Buster wrote a number of letters to the press, pointing out the grave conditions under which the workers of Jamaica were employed, describing himself as a public defender and one who is for fair pay. Buster kept the fight along with Coombs. Buster's letters was extensively covered in Jamaica and incidentally in the British press, which attracted the British parliamentarians who started the defense of the Jamaican workers. During this period, there were disturbances in several parts of Jamaica, mostly in the sugar plantations that were established in Westmoreland, Trelawney, St. Thomas, and Clarendon. This initiated an investigation led by British parliamentarians in the response to the civil unrest and poor working conditions, which were later published in the Moyne Commission report. That commission did extensive work in Westmoreland and reviewed the arrests that took place during the riots. Thus in 1938, the British law lords passed a law legalizing trade unions in Jamaica. The Bustamante Industrial Trade Union and the Trade Union Congress were the first unions formed to dedicate to give the workers a voice at the workplace, a voice in the decision-making of terms and conditions of work, for example, time work, payment for work done, holidays with pay, maternity leave with pay, and vacation with pay. It was, as Buster said, a fair day's pay for a fair day work. The Trade Union Act of 1926 offered the unions in Jamaica legal protection and created an environment in which management and labor could work together under the theme better wages and condition of work guarantee better production. The first big disturbance which took place in Frome, the sugar factory, and they were followed by many wage strikes, many wage disputes in other parishes. Sugar was not the only industry which we had wage disputes. There was a strike in Westmoreland at the Kirkham Wharf. Coombs led that strike, but Coombs was unable to have a settlement for wage dispute. He sent for Bustamante. The dispute was settled, and the workers got higher wages, better working conditions, thus giving the unions a foothold for the first time in representation. There were many strikes and disruptions. Several workers were arrested and charged for disturbance. The major one was called Black Monday. I understand 4 workers were killed, and 1 policeman also died. It was from these labor upheavals that the trade unions were formed to champion the cause for Jamaican workers. In 1961 until 1971, Labor Day was celebrated by the trade unions in collaboration with their political parties. This celebration came as the workers rejoicing for what had done for them. These celebrations took the form of public rallies. Meetings and marches were held primarily in the corporate area. One section of workers were coming from the east, one was coming from the west. There were occasions when marches of opposing trade unions and political parties clashed, contrary to the original concept that Labor Day should be demonstrated as a unity among the workers of Jamaica, or for the workers of Jamaica. The birth of Labor Day then, in 1958, was Empire Day, was renamed Commonwealth Day in the agreement with the new post-colonial relationship between the nations of the former British Empire. In Jamaica, by then, the 24th day of May was already being celebrated informally as Labor Day, commemoration of labor upheavals, which took place on the 23rd and June 6 in 1938. In 1960 then, Prime Minister, or the Premier of Jamaica, Norman Manley, took to Parliament a resolution which abolished Empire Day, and on the 15th of June, a law to amend the holiday public general received unanimous support in the Legislative Council by all parties. May the 23rd was now to be known as National Labor Day and officially marked the anniversary of the first wave of working class strikes which took place in 1938. It is from this movement that Jamaica's 2 major political parties emerged. The journey of independence began. The focus of Labor Day had now shifted from the tradition of gratitude to the colonial masters, or celebrating Her Majesty's birthday, to a political independence and the importance of trade union. The workers of Jamaica started on a journey which today brought great benefits to all level of workers. Management have their own unions, the workers have their own unions, the civil service separated from farmers and general workforce. So the trade union became the most important organ from which governments came to make Jamaica where we are today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Charles. Your insights and perspectives on the labor movement in Jamaica have been most important. Your presentation was informative, and of course, we know that one day we will get to hear more about your own experience in this movement. Earlier on, I mentioned the labor riot at Frome in the parish of Westmoreland. At this time, I wish to take you on a journey with an excerpt from the story of Westmoreland, written by none other than Marguerite Curtin, a publication which was sponsored by the JN Foundation. I'm going to read from chapter 18 protest in Westmoreland from the text The Story of Westmoreland, a Jamaican Parish by Marguerite Curtin. By the early 1930s, the full force of the World Depression was being felt in Jamaica. In 1934, William Alexander Clark, who was born in 1884 in the district of Blenheim in Hanover, returned to the island after many years of living in Spanish America and the United States. Now officially known as Alexander Bustamante, he set up business as a money lender in Kingston and began to take an active interest in the social and economic conditions of the working class, where there was great poverty resulting from widespread unemployment and low wages. Soon he began agitating on behalf of the workers, writing letters to the newspapers, decrying the deplorable social conditions. The following year, 1935, Marcus Mosiah Garvey, who had been living in Kingston for the past 8 years, left for London to continue his mission from there. His time in Jamaica had been far from easy, as his adversaries had sought every means to discredit him and destroy his movement. The vacuum in leadership left by his departure was to be filled by Alexander Bustamante, who was to play the most central role in organizing Jamaica's workers. The disturbance at Frome in May 1938 was not the first to occur in Jamaica in the 1930s. In May 1935, there had been a riot in Falmouth, Trelawney. In December 1936, there was trouble at Kingston Racecourse, and in September 1937, there were strikes in St. James. At Surge Island Estate in the parish of St. Thomas, workers had gone on strike in January 1938, 4 months before events at Frome came into the limelight. There was already an artisans union at Frome, known as the Jamaica Workers' Union, but unskilled laborers had no organization of any kind. Poor arrangements for the payment of the workers by the company contributed to their growing aggravation and uncertainty about job tenure. With the building of the new factories in progress, besides field workers and factory workers, there were also construction workers on the site, and all three categories were being paid at different rates. In addition, the number of persons being hired fluctuated from week to week. There was also a rumor in circulation that a daily wage of 4 shillings, $1, was going to be paid. Wages actually paid were between 1 shilling and 2 shillings per day, though women like Beatrice Powell, who said that she cut, picked, weeded grass, broke stone, and did everything, got only 6 pence per day. For 1 box of stones, she was paid 6 pence, and for 2 boxes, 2 shillings. Perplexing to the workers was why they were paid so late on Saturdays, too late for them to go to the market and the shops nearby. Alexander Bustamante first got a foothold in Westmoreland by successfully negotiating higher wages for workers at Kirkham's Wharf. Another trade union activist, A.G.S. Coombs, had been unable to break through in discussions with Kirkham, and so some of the workers, including Edwin C. Brooks and Oswald Mayer, sent a telegram to Buster in Kingston asking him to come down to Savannah Lamar and negotiate on their behalf. By 4 p.m. on the same day, Bustamante was at the wharf. He got Kirkham to agree to paying men working on ships 9 shillings per day instead of 6 shillings and 3 pence per day, while those working on the wharf were to get 3 shillings and 6 pence instead of 2 shillings and 6 pence. Having been successful at the wharf, Bustamante started to keep meetings all over the parish, including at Frome Estate, where Charlie Salmon and some other workers took him on to the compound and aired their grievances to him. He then left for Kingston. To a great extent, what happened at Frome on May 2, the day that came to be called Black Monday, was a local disturbance. The events at Frome began to stir up workers throughout the island. It was on May 20 that problems started in Kingston. Bustamante and St. William Grant had emerged as leaders of the protesting stevedores along the waterfront. After making long speeches urging the unity among the longshoremen, the crowd turned ugly. Bustamante and Grant were arrested. Ken Post wrote that May 23rd, 1938 was the day when Kingston Poor took control of its central streets. I now turn to chapter 19, entitled Raising Cain. The days following the disturbance at Frome saw the emergence of unions with leaders who, as the events of the year 1938 unfolded, would take up the cause of the rights of workers in the cane fields and on the docks. There was also talk among Jamaicans of the day when the British Crown Colony government would be no more and Jamaica would become an independent nation. During the riots of 1938, Governor Edward Denham died unexpectedly, and the position of governor was filled by Sir Arthur Richards, whose mandate it was to ensure the security of the colony in a world that was once again on the brink of war. The subversive activity of any kind would not be tolerated, and there would be internment in Upper Camp, the army headquarters for both alien residents in the island and troublesome Jamaican labor leaders. In London, the West Indian Royal Commission was appointed on August 5, 1938, to investigate and make recommendations on the social and economic conditions in the colonies of the British West Indies. Because of the urgency of the situation in Jamaica, the island was the first colony to be visited, and the members of the commission arrived in mid-November 1938. Sessions of the commission were held at the Constant Spring Hotel, described by the Daily Gleaner as a luxury hotel. It was about 4 miles out of the city of Kingston in a semi-rural setting, surrounded by a golf course. For those who could afford the fare, the electric tram car dropped passengers off at the hotel gate. Many would have to walk, and the Daily Gleaner referred to those who came barefoot. The Moyne Commission, as it came to be called, was led by Walter Edward Guinness, Lord Moyne. Among its highly respected members was Sir Walter Citrine, General Secretary of the British Trades Union Congress. The good friend of Jamaica, Sir Sidney Olivier, the former governor, was also present. Members of the commission visited several parts of the island to obtain first-hand information on what conditions were really like. One of these commissioners was Professor Engledow, the agricultural expert who went on an extended inspection to the western parishes. The proceedings of the commission were to be conducted in open sessions, and the custodes of all the parishes were invited to attend, including the custos of Westmoreland, the Honorable Hugh Clark. At their request, they were granted a private hearing. Several of the Jamaican leaders were invited to views. Among these were Alexander Bustamante and Norman Manley, elected leader of the newly formed People's National Party. The well-known Jamaican industrialist James Clore, also in attendance, made many recommendations. Playing an important role in the proceedings was the Deputation Committee, which was represented by Mr. C.A. McPherson, Mrs. Morris Knibb, Dr. O.E. Anderson, the Reverend Ethelred Brown, and the defense lawyer at the recent trials in Savannah-Lamar, Mr. E.R.D. Evans. High on the Commission's agenda were questions concerning education and employment. The plight of sugar workers and small farmers was of immense concern. There were no collective labor agreements, and so the interests of the workers were unprotected. Registration of trade unions and the audit of their funds were strongly favored. It was urged that a levy on every ton of sugar produced would be introduced, and the funds obtained from this levy should go into a fund for the welfare of sugar workers. Although the members of the Moyne Commission, upon their return to Britain, managed to complete their report in good time, their findings were not released. By September 1939, the war between Britain and Germany had begun. It has been suggested that Britain withheld this information as she feared that the findings might be used as propaganda against her by the enemy. The Commission's report exposed the horrible conditions which existed on the island. In the meantime, however, some of its recommendations were put into practice. For example, it suggested that among East Indians, marriages conducted by Indian priests should be legitimized and validated. For the island, wartime meant shortages of many imports, the most important being gasoline. It also meant that some Jamaicans became more self-reliant, planting food crops. Short-lived cottage industries such as confectionery and toys had their beginnings in this period. What a memory. Today we have 4 distinguished panelists who will discuss the relationship between the labor movement and land ownership, the relevance of the labor laws in place today and their historical origins, as well as the effects of COVID-19, that dreaded pandemic, on the labor market. Among our guests is the Honorable Donna Parchment Brown, political ombudsman. She is the first woman to hold that office. Mrs. Parchment was sworn in as political ombudsman on November 16, 2015. She is an attorney at law. She has worked across the Caribbean as a mediator, trainer, and development practitioner. She has also served as Custos Rotolorum of the Parish of St. Andrew, as a member of the Peace Management Initiative, the National Reparations Council, chair of Hampton School for Girls, and on other national and regional bodies, including Jamaica Cooperative Credit Union, League Limited, and the UN Women, and NGO, Regional Advisory Council of Latin America and the Caribbean. She is well loved, and we are so looking forward to hearing from her. We also have Mr. Danny Roberts, the lead partner of IR Plus Consultants and senior lecturer and head of the Hugh Shearer Labor Studies Institute at the Consortium for Social Development and Research at the Open Campus of the University of the West Indies. An ACP EEC scholar, Mr. Roberts is a graduate of the University of the West Indies with a BA Honors in Communication with Social Sciences and a Master of Philosophy in Government. He was the recipient of Jamaica's 4th highest national honors in 2009, the commander of the Order of Distinction for his contribution to the trade union movement. We also are pleased to present Mr. O'Neill Grant, the president of the Jamaica Civil Service Association. Mr. Grant became the 16th president of the JCSA on the 28th of May 2011. Prior to assuming his role as president, he was honorary treasurer to the JCSA, a position he held for 7 years. He is a JC alumnus. We all know that the JC boys are now celebrating still from champs, where he excelled in track and field. Mr. Grant is a trained accountant, auditor, and financial analyst with more than 27 years of experience, both in the private and public sectors. To round off our panelists, help me welcome Mr. Rudolph Thomas, who serves as a vice president of the Bustamante Industrial Trade Union, a position he has held since 2017. Mr. Thomas joined the ranks of the BITU in March 2008 as a union officer, and then transitioned through the positions of negotiating officer, senior negotiating officer, and assistant general secretary prior to holding his current post. Ladies and gentlemen, we now welcome our panelists, who will each have 5 minutes to make a brief presentation in today's topic. We will begin with the Honorable Donna Parchment Brown.
Thank you so much. I am so happy to be here with this distinguished panel. And I want to congratulate JN Foundation that they have thought it fit to organize such a discussion. With its honorable roots in Westmoreland, it brings its rural pedigree to the nation and helps us all. It is, of course, in Westmoreland where the third wave of decolonization was led. And so it's important for us to look back at what happened then and the benefits we have all received as a result. Trade unions, the labor movement, often their role is minimized today in Jamaica. But each of us here on this panel can say without fear of contradiction that we would not be sitting here without the work done by unions, and there's much left to be done. It was 100 years after emancipation in 1938 that the poor, hardworking mass of the population decided to raise Cain. They were seeking dignity, fairness, and respect as human rights, and they were prepared to die for them. From St. Thomas to Falmouth to Kingston and to Westmoreland, Jamaica was in a foment because people wanted to be respected and they wanted their labor to be treated as something of value. The state used force, but failed to stop the cry for justice and the movement towards where we are today. And as we celebrate Labor Day in 2021, we must look back. And I'm glad to be able to say men like Alexander Bustamante and Clifford Campbell emerged from Westmoreland and became national leaders. Labor, of course, includes all workers. And sometimes we forget this, you know. It doesn't matter if you're the CEO of a multinational organization, a senior public servant, an ancillary worker, a doctor. As long as you're not the owner of the enterprise, you fall into that group called labor. Even if you may put on a pretty word like management, you're still labor. And then, of course, we have the ununionized labor force. And they really we depend on unions to move the bar towards legislation that defines and promotes decent work, towards employment that protects the rights and interests of workers. And in fact, when we protect the rights and interests of workers, we protect the enterprise and we build productivity and we build profit for the benefit of all engaged. So for me, you know, when we think about the Kingston waterfront phase of the May 1938 call for justice, I want to talk about women a little bit. So 200 male protesters were strongly supported by a woman who I understand is soon to get a statue raised near the waterfront. This is Miss Aggie Bernard, Order of Distinction, who became a household name in Jamaica. A laundress, an ordinary woman, but a woman with the heart of a lion. In the spirit of Nanny, she was strategic, she was sacrificial, and she gave sustained effort to help those who were on the front line calling for better for all workers in Jamaica. And this was an ordinary woman. Of course, I might be forgiven if I say there is no such thing as an ordinary woman. You know, and so I mentioned some other women, the work and names of women like Edith Dalton James, the first woman to lead an education union, Patsy Edwards Henry, representing nurses today in difficult, challenging times, and Helen Davis White of Jalgo, who is a voice of reason and wisdom in all of the discussions we have in Jamaica. We must never overlook these women. We must not forget that this is a work that is being done by men and women equally here in our great country. And yet, issues of equal pay, equal status, the need for appropriate childcare continue to be outliers, needing to be addressed so we can have fairness in the labor market and in our country. The evolution of Labor Day, which we're celebrating, from celebratory marches and meetings to honorable work days, was, I'm told, partly due to clashes, political clashes that occurred and turned joyful celebration into ugly minutes. We still have alignment of labor unions and political parties, but it is important that we go forward on the idea that everybody matters. It doesn't matter what their political or labor union allegiance is. The work is to benefit everyone. Labor groups and workers in general, I feel, are still vulnerable to abuse, especially where there's a power imbalance that's very obvious in their organization, or where there's a lack of agreed standards and there's lack of respect for workers. It doesn't matter whether these workers are parliamentarians or security guards. They all deserve to be treated with respect and based on rules that are generally agreed. I therefore suggest that in negotiations, it's important that there's timely decision making, not that the power imbalance allows us to drag people on for a long time, waiting for adjustment of their emoluments. There should be benchmarking so that there is a sense of why a particular package is appropriate for a particular worker or group of workers. Gender awareness to meet differentiated needs of men and women in the workplace, because we're talking about working conditions as well as emoluments. How many bathrooms do we have? What are the stairs like? Disabled people, are we making sure that the workplace is set to meet their needs? And within that context, I believe conflict resolution skills are very important for both management and union to have harmonious, productive workplaces where people feel confident and not afraid to raise issues. Where we're afraid to raise problems, problems continue unabated and sometimes may break down the organization. These are critical complements, in my view, to legislation. As we know, legislation cannot cover every situation, but agreed principles can, and the legislation gives that the pillars to stand on. Sadly, underlying issues of the 1930s, documented by Marguerite Curtin in the story of Westmoreland, and let me pause to congratulate JN on the series of publications on the parishes. Of course, we know that Westmoreland, as we saw in the book, there are so many examples of strong agricultural work, businesses going on, and the important role of agriculture and agro-industry leading into the riots and protests of the 1930s. But today, in 2021, sadly, there are many unresolved issues, and I touched just three of them. Landlessness. This is an ongoing problem, which may need to go back on labor unions' agenda. The gap between capital and labor. Research shows that Jamaica has an unfortunate and extreme gap between the rich and the poor, often defining capital and labor, and a continued uneven distribution of wealth, even when one is a contributor to its creation. Today, priority is needed for several things. I would touch on just three. COVID-19 vaccination, and what are the legal implications for workers? Redundancy rules, are they sufficiently clear that in the context of a pandemic, workers and employers are treated fairly when furloughs or layoffs or redundancy is necessary? And remote work regime, are we ensuring that the tools required to work effectively are provided for workers, and the accountability that organizations require of their workers is facilitated within the remote work context that we're in now? To work through these problems, it is important that labor unions be brought front and center into consultation, because what they achieve benefits everyone, whether you're unionized or not. And it's important that we all become knowledgeable and supportive of this effort. Consultation is required, and perhaps from consultation, new laws, or at least agreed principles and policies. Thank you for the opportunity. Those are my brief early remarks.
Brief and sumptuous. Thank you very, very much, Mrs. Parchment Brown. You have given us not only a context for understanding the need to center women, but you've also reminded us that if we're not the owner, we are all in the laboring class. And you've also given us solid recommendations and suggestions for how to move forward. We will now invite Mr. Danny Roberts to make his presentation.
Thank you very much. Congratulations to the Jamaica National Foundation for putting on this very important discussion forum. As we talk about raising Cain and moving from raising Cain to remote work, it is important for us to have an understanding of both context and circumstance. And so if you look back at 1938, the historical context which laid the basis for two things to happen. Firstly, the formation of trade unions, and their role in the defense of the rights of workers, the dignity and the justice of the laboring class. And secondly, the emergence of labor laws under the aegis of a colonial government, forced by circumstance so to do, but a recognition by them that there is an element of injustice, inhumane policies, etc., which existed for the vast majority of the Jamaican people. So therefore, in talking about the genesis of Labor Day, looking at the sacrifice that our foreparents made in respect to the development of labor laws today, and to talk about the evolution of labor laws, it brings into focus the whole question of a development paradigm. And to better understand that, there's a quote from former Minister of Justice and President of the Court of Appeal, Carl Rattray, and it says as follows, that the history of slavery, the relationships between the owners and the owned, the bitter struggles which led to emancipation, the post-abolition interface between the former slaves, those are the workers, and their former owners, the employers, all provided a background for the emergence of labor laws and employment practices in the Caribbean. End of quote. So that the framing 1938 was an important flashpoint, which have been graphically written about and demonstrated through the work of people like Richard Hart in Rise and Organize, Patrick Bryan and Carl Watson in their book, Not for Wages Alone, and Mr. Patterson in an inaugural distinguished lecture on the history and development of the modern trade union movement, Lessons from the Past, Prospects for the Future. And in considering our historical circumstance and linking it to the present situation, there are three important considerations which I think ought to be taken into account. First of all, I think that one has to recognize that the history of the working class has been a history of struggle, and that the development of Jamaica revolves around that struggle for labor. And at the heart of that is the question of that control of labor, whether it be under the Masters and Servants Act, coming through into the post-colonial period, and now in the modern 21st century globalization, that when you look, for example, at the change in the nature of the employment relationship, you're talking about contract workers, fixed-term contract, etc. All of those are designed to have some element of control over labor. And so it was in 1938, so it is today in the 21st century. Connected to that is a second very important point, that the struggle of the Jamaican workers and the need for us to achieve national development revolved around not only a relationship about wages, but Donna quite rightly touched on it, questions of dignity, respect, and equity. And invariably, what we have found out, that where workers are denied dignity, respect, and equity, that it manifests itself in a struggle around wages. And that has been researched and done by people like Carl Stone and Noel Cowell and some others. Perhaps one of the most important for me intervention in terms of setting the context for our labor relations is the Labor Relations Code, which speaks about the need for work and workers to be treated with dignity and respect. And underlying that, I think, are three fundamental principles governing our industrial relations practice. What has to do with efficiency, that is to say that employers need to ensure that the businesses are profitable and that there's growth and development and jobs can be created. Question of equity, which means that there has to be a sense of fairness in which workers are provided with reasonable return on their labor, and that the conditions of work fit the fundamentals as outlined by the ILO about the decent work agenda. And thirdly, that workers have to have a voice, that workers who are in an employment relationship have to have a say in how the conditions of their work evolve and develop, and how it is that they can help to improve and create the efficiency that is so important for the sustainability of the business. The third thing, I think, if we link that now to a post-pandemic environment, it is about drawing on the lessons of the past. What are the central thematic issues that we spoke about, and what it is that we would need to do in a post-pandemic era to address the question of the development agenda. And again, issues revolve around the question of the kind and nature of laws which are there to protect. One of the things that came out of the analysis of COVID and the whole recovery process is a recognition that employment protective legislations have to be in place to ensure that workers have a sense of job security, income protection, and health and well-being are provided. And that in those countries which were already advanced in those 3 years are the countries which are expected to have a more rapid recovery process than others who may not have so. So the question of dignity, respect in a modern context has to be parallel against that same lack of dignity and respect which existed prior during the raising Cain 1938 period. Labor Day was introduced in 1973 by Michael Manley, and it sought, I believe, to convert the antecedents of the events of 1938 into what Manley himself regarded as a demonstration of popular faith in the social utility of work. Mm-hmm. And that has a psychological meaning to it, because the question about how we see work and how we see ourselves as workers and the dignity and respect that must be accorded us is central to understanding and our sense of self in the development of the country and the dignity that is so important. So that psychological impact needs to be seen as an important part of our existential reality going forward. So when we look at the fundamental issues which gave rise to 1938, the report of the Moyne Commission, which attempted to address issues like low wages, poor working conditions, but all encapsulated in a wider context of inequity, injustice, income disparity, then it is very evident that in going forward, and Donna made mention of that, in going forward in a post-pandemic era, that we have to bear those in mind so that the policies, programs, and laws which we seek to establish have to make that fundamental shift to address issues of that growing income disparity that is now existing globally, etc. Questions of equity and fairness and justice, that is so important, and a recognition that the workers also have to have a voice and a say in matters relating to their interest and their welfare. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Mr. Roberts, for reminding us about those key sources for understanding the labor movement in Jamaica. Key sources, many persons don't really appreciate the fact that there are persons who have spent their time documenting some of these things, and the sources are there for us to be able to access. Thank you also for centering the whole question of equity, dignity, workers having a voice, and more importantly, that these are part and parcel of a developmental agenda, a developmental paradigm. Very, very important, and I think that followed really nicely from Donna Parchment's presentation. So now I want to invite Mr. O'Neill Grant to make his presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Stanley-Nair. And good afternoon, all those who are tuned in to this broadcast. And for the discussion, I want to center my comments, not just on what happened in 1938, beginning in Westmoreland, and just to say that my father is from Westmoreland, still have family there. And so it has a special meaning for me that the labor movement, the modern labor movement, had its genesis in what happened at Fulham in Westmoreland. And for today, me to speak as a trade unionist is quite humbling. The trade union movement got some strength from the passage of the Trade Unions Act in 1990. And they first organized the set of workers, as far as I'm aware, was in the civil service, where the Jamaica Civil Service Association became the association for workers in the public sector. It is important to contextualize it in that way because we were under colonial rule. And a lot of what we were experiencing as workers in the public sector was manifest throughout the entire population. But because of the rules that exist at that time, the level of representation that the workers were getting was basically confined to matters of pay and compensation and not much more. With what happened in 1938, there was a deeper appreciation of the conditions under which the workers were working and the fact that we had what we refer to and we still refer to today as the working poor. And this again now causes me to contrast where we were then with where we are now and what our national vision is: to make Jamaica the place of choice to live, work, raise families, and do business. So let's unpack that. The place of choice to live. The landless is still very much rampant, and these are workers. When you look at the conditions under which the landless live in this country, it tells us that we have not progressed much further from where we were in 1938, when the Moyne Commission spoke to the harsh conditions under which workers live. The place of choice to work. Jamaica, unfortunately, has a reputation of being one of the worst practitioners in terms of states where contract employment is concerned, where we have used contract employment not as a means of enhancing productivity, but to destabilize the worker or to keep them what we refer to as precarious in the nature of their work. Here today, gone tomorrow. You can't build a life because you can't live properly under precarious work. Raise families. If the worker does not have security under the decent work agenda, which speaks to security of employment, how it is that the worker is going to raise a family. A family means that you have to plan for today and tomorrow, because that is how we raise our children, not for today, but for tomorrow. We can't do that. And the businesses that we have in Jamaica focus so much on all the factors of production except labor, that they find themselves not being as competitive as they should be. And we wonder to ourselves often why it is that Jamaica's productivity is so low. It all centers around the fact that we have not valued properly that one great resource that we have, which is our people. So we speak of the Jamaica being the place of choice. And we have listed all these elements of it being a place of choice. But the most important of those that underpins all of that is the worker. And if we examine the 2030 vision, and if we examine all the labor laws that we have, we recognize that absent in all of it is a pure and real consideration of the worker. A few years ago, we started the work that was started and led by the late Lloyd Goodley for the comprehensive reform of the labor market, recognizing that total factor productivity was missing. And in the book that we are referencing, we recognize that Tate and Lyle saw how important total factor productivity was, because they started to retool and to ensure that the workers were able to produce at a higher level of productivity that they were accustomed to before. But there was no system in place to foster and enhance productivity, and the policies that existed at that time didn't go into the refinement of sugar. It was done at a certain level and then shipped overseas. Examine what we are doing today. We are still bringing our productive capacity up to a point, and then shipping the rest overseas for added value, which we are not doing. A few years ago, we started a special economic zone that was going to be dealing with added value in the productive cycle. But when we examined where we have our workforce, we did not equip them. We have not equipped them to actually produce using that value-added concept. And so we are now locked into another cycle where we are in the multinational arrangements where foreign workers are coming in and are executing those high-level functions that we are supposed to be executing as a sovereign nation. Those who are trained and competent to do certain jobs are left out of the loop because the bilateral arrangements doesn't facilitate those higher trained workers. And so we have mass migration of workers, not from the rural parishes to Kingston, but from Jamaica to other places. So now comes the pandemic, 2021, as we were in 1919, when we were rocked by a pandemic. And we have a situation of remote work. And we are contemplating how do we treat the workers under flexible work arrangement. And because we have not invested as much in technology as we should have, given the opportunities that were present for that investment, we are now adjusting, albeit steeply, to the whole issue of remote work. And a lot of agencies, ministries, departments, and agencies, and private sector entities have indicated that, yes, we have made the adjustment and we are doing quite well. And kudos to them that they have made the transition. But what has remained is that the worker and the conditions of the worker in a remote work environment has not been properly assessed. Because to live, work, raise families, and do business oftentimes leaves the worker out. So Jamaica being a country that has 60% of the workforce being women, children, heads of households are now finding it difficult to balance their work lives with the lives of their families. And that is the construct that we have not properly considered in the context of moving from raising Cain to remote work. It's not all gloom and doom. I think as a country, Jamaica is doing fairly well with the level of resources that we have, but we have not invested enough in our human capital, and that is why we are not reaping the benefits that we can reap from the possibilities that a COVID-19 could have presented for us. The Jamaican public sector is to create an environment for all of what we are discussing to happen. But as a country, we have slacked off in the investment in public services. We are just picking that up now with the transformation of the public sector, looking more at technology to see how we deliver public services. And we have to do that. We have to strengthen that. Because if we are not reaching those who are underemployed and unemployed, they must be served by public services. And until we reach that point that we have full employment, the public services have to be strengthened to support the workers. And in a remote work environment, we find ourselves not able to properly adjust to all of these. What has happened? In 1938, we had this flare-up of violence in various places. In 2021, in a pandemic era, we are having significant levels of violence still perpetrating on the fellow poor. it is a cycle that we need to get out of, and the only way that we can get out of it is by looking at public services and how it supports workers and how it meets and how it allows us to meet the vision 2030, Jamaica being the place of choice to live, work, raise families, and do business. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Grant. You have made a connection between the uprisings of the 1930s with the Vision 2030 and the way in which Jamaica seems to be in a cycle of not valuing the worker. And as I heard you, my heart sank, and I'm sure those who are out there viewing and listening perhaps would feel the same way, that here it is, the very ways in which we are not valuing the worker show up even in our Vision 2030. And that's something we absolutely need to check ourselves on as a country. Thank you. I now invite Mr. Roddy Thomas to make his presentation.
Thank you, Madam, and to all the viewers who would be enjoying our discourse. First, I want to, with my colleague declared his lineage and association with Westmoreland, let me also do. My father's family is from Westmoreland, but from Darlington, Westmoreland. We have never discussed this, even though we've known each other for years. Another thing I have to do before I start is to acknowledge the foundation putting this event on, this course on, rather than just skipping Labor Day, as some other organizations will be doing this year, unfortunately. I'm happy to be here. I believe it gives us an opportunity to look at the work done by the labor movement and certainly by the founding father of the BITU from a different perspective. The work at the struggle started when we had this whole heap of Cain that was being raised, and a matter of having to treat with it. This was happening all across Jamaica, really and truly, and took real championing to arrest and bring to a closure in some form, way, shape, or form. But what I want to point out is that I do believe that there are parallels between then and now, clear, distinct parallels that we have to examine as we move towards an era that includes remote work. The working class and factors that would have created the unrest are things that we know. It's a little bit more than just wages. It's about the decent way that they're treated, and you went in depth in it. It was some hungover behaviors from colonial administrators, really and truly dealing with some people that would have just moved from slavery. Right? And it was the challenge and struggle of even owning land, because what the labor movement came to find out and connect itself with is that the ownership of land for the freeman at that time, for the average worker coming out of that era, was probably the most distinctive mark for him, to own land from which he could provide shelter and food for his family. And so I think that's where the connection was made with the labor movement, and it's something that Bustamante continued to advocate for all through his life. It wasn't just in the riots. The labor movement, by virtue, has adopted it as a critical element that they must pursue, and that continues up to today. If we look at some mergers that happened also with some building societies just about in the 70s, you would have realized that it was out of that came the whole Jamaica National Front. And land ownership or house ownership has remained critical to them in all their existence, just as it has remained critical to the unions and to the labor movement. I want to suggest now, as it relates to COVID-19, that a term that O'Neill used is not just doom and gloom. It's not a story of just doom and gloom. It has had several effects on labor. It has had effects on the labor market, and it certainly would have had effect as wide as was mentioned, our Vision 2030, that we continue to look to. But I want to suggest that in many respects, COVID-19 would have served as a catalyst, an accelerant to drive us or create the opportunity for us to be driven down a path where certain things that we expect to happen over a more protracted period of time can possibly now happen in a shorter period of time. We're talking about the use of technology. We're talking about how we access banking services now. We're talking about how we educate our people. And I must point out that I am involved in a little study that is trending to show that not only are the youths benefiting from these tablets and these online devices, but there are parents that are now re-educating themselves because of this access that avails itself to them. As we celebrate this year, I just want to highlight also, and this is particularly because of how trade unions are viewed sometimes. I want to highlight that the work of Bustamante was never one that called for destruction and demolition. It's one that had at the root of it the dialogue, conversations, and trying to build relationships that would engender longevity of employment, and by so doing, improve the standard of workers. I believe it's important that I point that out now, especially where we are, when we are looking to move to, and we're symbolically using remote work, but it's a whole heap more than just remote work that is being occasioned by the changes out there today. But as we start looking into jobs that have changed, new jobs that have come around, some jobs that will never see the light again, new ways of operating. Do we need these big buildings to show that we are big companies, or will there be a change to that? When we look at the uncharted, unnavigated, undescribed way that persons are indeed working from home, it is something that requires the labor movement to use the same tools that were used back in those riots, the same discussions, the same self-giving, almost self-sacrificing, to engage with the partners and achieve the best for workers at this time. So I believe that whilst we are faced here with the changes, it's something that we have to embrace. It's something that we have to look. And when I speak about stakeholders, it includes legislators. Is this an opportunity to overhaul some of our labor laws that come from 1940s? We have been crying for overhaul of some of them for some time. And we know there are going to have to be legislative changes to accommodate the new world of work. So I'm saying that there's an opportunity there that we have to seize, all have to seize, not only us here that may be a representative group of colleagues, but as a nation we have to seize so that we can maximize and leverage the best outcome for workers and for nations.
Thank you so much, Mr. Thomas. And I'm going to take that last word, leveraging. That in the context of remote work, we're talking about more than just remote work, because it is also decent work. It's also about equity. It's also about repurposing. It's also about pivoting. There are so many things inside of that category of remote work. And I want to thank you, therefore, for centering legislative change, because in echoing what Mrs. Parchment Brown has said, we know that there are some things on the books, some laws that don't serve us anymore. And we need, as a country, to be able to look at ourselves in critical ways, including within the context of our legislative frameworks. So I want to thank you. We will now open the floor for some questions, and we do have some questions from our viewers. The first question for any of our panelists to respond is that Labor Day nowadays focuses on volunteerism and not the historical roots or accomplishments of the labor movement. Is a shift in focus of Labor Day to the detriment of the workers, or a betrayal of our history, would you say?
The shift to volunteerism actually underpins, in my mind, that a lot of the work that we do is undervalued. And if we don't do more than what we can do for less pay than we get, then we won't move ourselves forward. So, but the workers' concept of Labor Day is not to do what we refer to as the regular 9-to-5 type of work, but to look within our communities and to see those areas of social services, public services that have been underserved during the year, to see how can we give up our time as workers to improve on these, because if we don't, others won't be able to do it for us. And to me, that was what was envisioned in relation to Labor Day, to give up ourselves freely and voluntarily to ensure that our communities within which we live, work, and so on, are improved as workers. That's what it basically means to us. I don't think there's a shift per se. It's a reinforcement of what the ethos of a worker is, that would have underpinned the concept of Labor Day, and I think it does, to some extent, continues today, although there are some persons who look at Labor Day as another day to just rest from all work and to prepare themselves the next day for more work. But we continue to see, though, that the theme of Labor Day continues to be giving of self, as Roddy would have said, giving more to see how we can leverage our personal lives within our communities.
So that volunteerism is very much enshrined in this context of nation building.
Right.
Yeah, Donna did touch upon that.
Yes.
The question of the Labor Day prior to 1973 was actually a show of force, more a competition among unions, particularly the BITU and NW, rather than an expression of unity and a sense of purpose. And so what we have seen, as I mentioned earlier, is really a change in the nature and a recognition that the issue of 1938, and incidentally, my mother is from Westmoreland as well. So, and then the sentimentality in reading the book. So the shift is not to continue to celebrate, in a narrow sense, the importance of the struggle, and important as that is, but to recognize that beyond that struggle, which we have to do from time to time when the necessity arises, but to recognize that the totality of the workers' existence must also involve the psychological aspect, the emotional aspect, another aspect of it. And in fact, having Labor Day, we also have Workers' Week, which gives us an opportunity to reflect on the lessons learned from 38 and that period, and to see how we can turn it in a positive way, in a more purposeful way, to advance the interests of the society and to create a sense of equity and justice and fairness that is at the center of it all.
If I may just add one point to what's been really interesting. Labor Day activities often include physical labor, painting, cleaning verges, planting trees, and so on. And I think a big part of this is honoring the masses, honoring those who would have been seen as the most humble, as the least important in the pecking order, but that what they do is critical to the survival of everyone in the country. We must eat food. We want beautiful places. And so if the person who normally works only with computers or with a fancy pen or in air conditioning is out there painting the steps at the police station or planting fruits at a primary school, then it's a real affirmation of those from whom we came.
Affirmation is that word. Thank you very much, all of you. We do have another question. Some would argue that the cause which drove the labor movement, the need for humane treatment of workers and fair compensation, have largely been achieved. So what then is the cause which drives today's labor organizations?
Well, the question is no. It has not been achieved.
We just established
Frankly,
that.
it has not.
Has not.
Again, context is very important. When you contextualize the situation, globalization has resulted in a widening of the gap between the rich and the poor, a widening of income disparity, questions of job insecurity, which O'Neill mentioned, questions of a lack of dignity and respect that ought to be accorded workers, particularly those who are not unionized, because they have no say in terms of the conditions of their employment. So that the comparative analysis have to recognize that in the 1930s, that disparity, inequity, injustice manifested and was represented a particular way. That now in the age of globalization, it exists, but it now manifests itself quite different. But the substantive issues about the question of fairness and justice may have changed, but it still exists and still is an issue that has to be fought, not only in Jamaica, but globally.
Yes. I think we can absolutely establish that and we're all agreed.
Yes.
So let me move to remote work and today's, the context of the pandemic. Another question that came in: work and the definition of work is evolving. Some factors driving the evolution of work. We know they're changing. There's the emergence of a digital economy, remote work, removal of geographical borders, the whole globalization becoming even more intense, and limitations on employment. How do unions remain relevant in this environment?
Well, if I may, I think that we are more relevant now because of the environment. The changes that are there leave workers more vulnerable than ever. There are different interpretations and agendas that persons want to push. You have employers that interpret what they are able to do differently from others. You have certain things that the workers have to have a voice behind them to protect. You have, for example, the right to unplug, to disconnect. You cannot be working from home. And because home in some regards becomes the workplace, that you are constantly at work. It doesn't work that way. As a matter of fact, it's something that the union movement has been paying keen attention to since there has been this shift to working from home. There are other aspects of it also. So you let people go and work from home, but what conditions are they working from home in? Normally, we would have had legislative protection somewhat, even though we're still debating our ASH, but would have some level of protection for workers and the environment that they are in. When they are at work, at home, is it that we just leave them to sit around a dining table chair? I know that thing will damage you. The research is there that shows it. Dining room chairs and working with your laptop on the dining room table. It cannot be done. It's not right. Ergonomically controversial to the hours that you spend working. So you have those issues that have to be fought. You have matters related to the security of data and information. 18 months ago, think about it, 18 months ago, maybe as little as 15, if overzealous Sue was to try to carry home files to complete her reports and be on time and look good for the organization, it might mean our termination. Now you want to know why she hasn't carried home the files? Why are they still in the office? Because she's working from home. When these documents go home, how are they secured? What is the exposure of the worker? What is the exposure of the worker? So there are myriad of things that makes the trade unions more relevant now, because we have to, there are best practices out there that have been published by the ILO, etc., that we have had to constantly be retooling ourselves by being a part of and retraining ourselves, edifying ourselves. So we have to be that voice for those workers in this very, very exposed and precarious time, if I dare use the precarious.
If I may,
Even though the world of work is changing, the nature of work doesn't change. And the worker, the definition of the worker doesn't change. And we saw the landmark case of Uber, where the workers, the persons who were deemed contractors, independent contractors, were now defined as workers because they walked, talked, ate, slept, and worked like workers. And so they were defined as workers. And we have the same challenges in our own labor laws, that we have one labor law that has a definition of the worker, but it is not supported in the other pieces of legislation. And so you have these challenges with dealing with matters of compensation and redress if the workers are treated unfairly. Some things that we still need to work on in a remote work environment.
Of course, the remote work environment is really the worker subsidizing the employer by creating the space in which the work is performed. And what does that say for just the basic compensation package, as well as any other material benefits that should come to the worker if there's a saving? And, you know, being global now, there's a bigger opportunity with working digitally. Even this event that we're engaged on today is a global event. Normally it would have just had maybe coverage by the media, but instead it's global. And that is the case now for people who are working in organizations, and liability for certain actions may be different from what it was before they started working remotely. So awareness, and who else but the unions? There is no other group that cares about this matter enough to do the research and the advocacy. And we all should be calling on the unions to help the workers in general in this new dispensation.
So opportunity and liability,
Yes.
the unions were always there, and they're even more relevant today in light of those changing opportunities and liabilities with the context of work.
Yes.
So we have a final question. Over the past decade, more women have emerged as leaders in their field, but are perceived not to advance as quickly or receive equal pay as male counterparts. How do we champion gender equality in the workplace, especially in this time of new liabilities and new opportunities?
Well, we have the law equal pay for equal work. Well, two things. We have laws in place, but the provisions of those laws are not acted upon. And perhaps it is also that many persons are unaware, workers are unaware of their right to, unaware perhaps and unafraid to raise some of these issues of discrimination that exist. In a review of our labor laws, we certainly have to strengthen those laws to create a greater sense of balance and of fairness and justice on a gender scale. When we introduced the flexible work arrangement policy, we made amendments to several laws, and in fact removed the women's employment law because it provided for discrimination against women, etc. So that in anything that we do in terms of an examination of labor law, a cross-cutting theme has to be gender. and the need for us to recognize the importance of increasing our level of awareness through training and other programs that help persons to better understand their rights and to have them protected. And the state has a role to play in ensuring that there are adequate provisions in place to protect workers, so that even if they raise those issues and there's act of victimization, the state can take the appropriate action.
I think that's so important. You know, we have a national gender policy which is intended to ensure that both men and women are treated equitably in the workplace, in support of some other legislation that exists. And in a number of public and private sector entities, there are gender focal points whose task it is to be supporting the organization in ensuring that it is always gender aware. One of the challenges, I think, with disparity in income and so on is that most workers don't know what the other workers earn, except in the context of labor negotiations with unions. People don't know, and even in an organization that's unionized, there are others who are not, and who may be called by the same name, but who are actually enjoying different packages. And it's very difficult to get this information. And of course, Jamaica, we have this big idea about bad mind, you know, that sort of informs everything we do. So when you call out that something should be done, it's because you're against somebody else getting. And I think we really need to throw this bad mind thing out the door altogether and be focused on how do we value what people bring to the table and make everyone get, not because I like you, but because this is what the job requires.
Outside the provisions, though, that would force us to behave in a particular way, I think there has to be a change of mind.
Yes.
There has to be a willingness. I think the jobs that may have been male-dominated for since forever, we have to be able to welcome females rather than them being lucky to have attained that position. Right. I think I would just want to add that, because from my mind, it's critical. You can always dance around certain provisions. Yes, both persons were interviewed, but the male got through because of so and so. We have to be willing to take these females fairly on board when they are suitable, best suitable for these roles.
Gender mainstreaming in the realist sense of the term.
Yes. And for me, where I sit in the public sector, because of the scalar system that we use, we don't see the disparity as clearly as we see it between the genders. However, what we have seen is a geographical discrimination in terms of how we compensate workers in the public service. So we don't have people being compensated fairly, whether you're a man or a woman, for doing the same work because of where you live. So persons who live in Kingston doing the same work that persons who are living, say, in St. Catherine get a different set of pay on a scale. So one of the things that we welcome was this whole compensation review for the entire public sector. We are hoping that this gender neutral or the application of the gender lens to compensation will now transcend to the rest of the economy. We have seen some companies now using these classification systems to grade workers, so you don't have them now arbitrarily deciding that this person must get this pay versus that pay, and that is now removing the arbitrariness from compensation that we have seen in some instances that would have caused the disparity. Jamaica is lauded for having the largest number of women in managerial positions.
Yes.
But if you look at the very, very top of organizations, they are still absent. And that is where the real decisions are made. And until they're in that very, very top, and we populate that very, very top equally, we're not going to make enough movement along the gender line that we want to make to ensure that there is equality. But we have some ways to go, and we are going to be making it up.
May I just say that discrimination is between rural and urban in terms of wage goes back to 1938.
Yes.
In fact, goes back to 1932 when they started to track wage, etc. So the persons in Kingston getting a higher rate than persons in the rural areas. And the discrimination also exists between public and private employers in the rural areas as against Kingston.
Yes.
So reminding us again that there is so much we have to remember about 1938 and how far we have not necessarily moved from the conditions back then.
Yeah.
We could be here for the rest of the day discussing this topic.
Of course.
But I want to now thank you all, our presenters, our audience members. This has indeed been an honor and a pleasure for me. I have certainly learned a lot, and I know those who are viewing us would have been stimulated in very particular ways in relation to our history, and more importantly, this contemporary moment in which we must move to make our conditions for workers much better.
Mm-hmm.
I have learned so much, and I know that we will be watching, viewing, paying attention to even the legislative changes that must come for our workers. Most importantly, we have emphasized the importance of the work of our forefathers, and I am one to honor our ancestors.
Absolutely.
Those who have come before, we have walked on their shoulders, and we must remember the work that they have done for us to be where we are today. On behalf of the JN Foundation, I express gratitude to you, our panelists, for the robust discussion of this topic, from raising Cain to remote work, the evolution of work and labor laws in Jamaica. I think we have done justice to this topic, and I really am thanking you also from me as moderator. I also invite everyone to visit the Parish Histories of Jamaica website. That's www.parishhistoriesofjamaica.org, to read the histories of the 7 parishes which have been published now. That's Portland, Trelawney, St. Mary, St. Thomas, St. Catherine, St. Elizabeth, and St. James. Once again, thank you for being with us, for tuning in. Have a productive Labor Day, a good evening, and walk good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, well done.